Hi everyone and welcome back. Recently I made a video demonstrating how to connect external sequencer, in my case my Korg PA3X, as a sequencer to my TASCAM Model 12 using the MIDI connection to synchronize my sequencer with TASCAM 12. If you haven't seen that video yet, I'll leave a link in the description and possibly a card, and you can watch that. It's quite an interesting way of expanding the capabilities of the TASCAM Model 12. Now in that demonstration, I used the MIDI settings of the TASCAM Model 12 and I set my MIDI clock and SPP, song position pointer, to be enabled. That way it basically allowed to send a clock signal to my sequencer and keep everything in sync. If you dive into the menu of the TASCAM Model 12 and into the MIDI setup, you'll find that there are two different settings there. One is called MIDI Timecode and another one is called MIDI Clock and /SPP. Now looking at the manual, we can read about the differences, but it doesn't really explain what they are, what MIDI timecode is, or what clock and SPP is, and which one you should use to synchronize your external hardware sequencer. Looking at the manual of the TASCAM Model 12 and page 53, we can read about the MIDI functions. It shows you how we can actually turn on and off the MIDI timecode, and we can turn on and off MIDI clock and SPP. Other than that, there's really not much information. The only other main information we need to read from this is that the MIDI timecode for the TASCAM Model 12 is 30 frames per second. Non-drop. This is important, and we will find out a little bit later on as I try to basically explain what the differences are between MIDI timecode and MIDI clock /SPP. Okay, first let's briefly talk about and let me basically explain what MIDI timecode is to my best of my understanding and ability. Of course, you can research yourself on Google and find out more about it. It's basically a running time from 0 minutes, seconds, hours to until the end of an audio file, because we are working with audio at the moment. So it starts from 0 and the timer starts running until the end of the song. And it's displayed in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames per second. The reason it's also using frames per second is because a lot of the time MIDI timecode is used to be able to synchronize to videos. Hence the reason, and what you see on the screen is how this interface, the MIDI timecode interface, allows you to select different frame rates from 24, 25, 30, and you can define it yourself as well. So that's what MIDI timecode is running of the time of a particular audio in this case. Now you can certainly use this to synchronize your external sequencer, but you will find out that this has some of its limitations. I mean, one of the reasons timecodes exist is that it allows someone to synchronize external hardware to an audio and a video production. Lighting is a great example, where if you have a song for a live show being played or for theatrical production, at certain time of the song or the audio running, you can have different lights come on and off and so on. So it's great for that purpose. But when it comes down to music production, timecode is not as accurate, and it's not really a great way to program a sequencer. So let's have a look at the MIDI clock and song position pointer and why it's more advantageous to use that in our music production than MIDI timecode. And that's why I had MIDI timecode turned off in my previous video example, and I used MIDI clock and song pointer position. Now looking at the MIDI clock and song position pointer, it has a little bit more details about our song. Because it refers to a clock, which is our tempo, and at the same time, it's a song pointer position. It's referencing to bars and beats and up to 1/24th of a note. So it's much more accurate in clocking wise. So it's going to be more accurate. And when we use the jog wheel to fast forward and rewind to certain part of a song, we, let's say bar 48, bit 3, it will synchronize to that. It will send fast forward to this bar, this beat, and start from there. Sure, you can do that with the timecode as well using the time, but it's musically more advantageous to use the bars and beats to go to certain part of the song arrangement. Now, another and more important advantage using the clock and SPP over timecode is that if you decide to change the tempo of the song within the master controller, in this case TASCAM Model 12 or any device, this could also be done in your DAW, but let's just stay with the TASCAM Model 12. We change the tempo and then the clock will change, but at the same time, it will change the tempo of our slave sequencer device or any other devices that's connected to that MIDI chain. So we can speed up and slow it down without affecting the position pointers of the song. We can still go to that bar 48, beat 3, whenever we wanted to. It will fast forward to that without recalculating the time in the timeline, in the timecode, where we're at. I hope that explains better. So that's why personally I use clock and SPP during my production when I'm using external hardware, synthesizers and sequencers to synchronize with my DAW or my hardware, and that's what I tend to use because musically it's much more easier to actually go to a certain point in a song than trying to find out using the timecode. Now that I shared the information about MIDI clock and SPP and the timecode, here is this on the screen. What you see is what my setup was in my home studio back in 1987-88 period. And the core of this setup was my Yamaha MT3X 4-track cassette recorder. And the reason I had chosen the Yamaha MT3X is because it had a dedicated one of the channels switchable to MIDI clock and SPP recording and playback. Sacrifice one of the tracks, so I'd be left with 3 analog tracks on my MT3X. But having done that, I could gain up to 16 or maybe even up to 32 MIDI controlled sound devices. So I had the Roland MSQ 700 as my sequencer, and I would play on my keyboard and record all of the arrangement parts in my MSQ 700. And I could also use my keyboard to play sounds on different channels of the MIDI channels to play my Kawai sound module, which the outputs of the audio would fit into a small mixer. Not exact that mixer, very similar to that one. And the output of that analog mixer would feed into spare analog inputs of my Yamaha MT3X, because not only it had 4 inputs that you could record onto the 4 tracks of the cassette, it had additional 2 inputs. So you could pan it left and right and have 2 extra inputs. So 6 audio files or audio tracks at any one time. So once I've recorded all my MIDI sequencing, I would record the clock signal on one of the tracks, dedicated tracks on my 4-track. And when I played it back, the sequencer followed the playback of the cassette and synchronized to the clock, which was recorded on a cassette. And even if I needed to speed it up and slow it down, I could do that with the pitch control of the cassette player, and that would affect the tempo of the sequencer as well. So everything played MIDI to my keyboards and to sound modules, and the audio part of those modules fed into the spare 2 inputs of my MT3X. So I had 3 analogs track that I could record: my guitar, my vocal, backing vocals, and I would use the same tracks to record instrumentation as well. So I could, while let's say I've got guitar, the main solo, when there is no vocal, I would use the same track for other instruments being added in there as well. And the output, so once we've recorded everything, the mix down was all manual. So I had to play everything, set all my sequencer into the right spots, press play, and that playback would go into my Yamaha 2-channel compressor. And from that compressor, the output would go into 4-head VCR recorder, because that's the highest quality I could get at that time. Remember, there's no computer in this chain. 87, hardly anybody had computers. I didn't have it anyway. So there was no computer involved. And the highest quality I could get without any degradation is recording to 4-head VCR. And that's how I actually did it. So I had some control of the output using the compressor going into the VCR to reduce the dynamics range as much as I could, so that we could get rid of the noise and the hiss, and have some sort of limiting factor in there as well. So compressing the data so we could get nice, good sound. And that VCR went into cassette duplication, and luckily they would actually accept that. And it got duplicated and the cassettes were out for the album. Normally we duplicate an album that we recorded, maybe 500 or 600 of them anyway, because that was just a small operation. That's how I initially started. Now later on, I upgraded my MSQ 700, which is now worth thousands of dollars more than what it was before. I should have kept it. But anyway, I upgraded into my Kawai Q80EX, which was another sequencer, but now I could actually save the data onto floppies, and it had more capabilities and capacity and note editing and all of that in that tiny window. You could do that, which was really great. Again, the reason I chose the Kawai Q80, because it did come with a clock and SPP in and out, which was the most important thing. Now, as to recording microphone, guitars or vocals, the microphone went into my mixer, and from the mixer's output, it went into my compressor, and I could either use a single channel or dual channel to use compression in series, and that fed into my cassette recorders, one of the channels. That way I could reduce the dynamic range of the vocals and hence have minimal tape hiss and noise and distortion or excessive saturation, tape saturation on my multi-track recorder. So as you can see on the back of the Kawai Q80 EX, it's got tape sync in and out, and this is basically a clock, MIDI clock and SPP SPP in pulse code modulation, so it's audible at the audible frequency, and that basically recorded onto one of the cassette tracks, and then it play back and it will follow it, and that's how it made it all work. So as you can see, MIDI clock and timecode They've been here for a long time, and they are quite useful to be able to synchronize multiple devices into a master clock, and you could achieve a lot more than just what you had available. And like in this example, instead of being able to record only on 4 tracks, don't even know how to count with my fingers, on 4 tracks, I would sacrifice one of the tracks to be able to synchronize and use up to 16 or more sounds in my music production, and without sacrificing any of the tape, so that there was no ping pong bouncing of the tracks, recording one instrument and then mixing it back again. I could keep recording as many times as I need, let's say my vocals or my guitar, until we got it right, without sacrificing any of the audio quality of the rest of the instrumentation, like drum machines, synthesizers, sound modules, and keyboards, etc. Well, I hope this video was enlightening, and you got some information about MIDI timecode. And if you have any comments, any questions, use the comment section below. I'm most likely to follow there as well. Till next time, as always, thanks for watching and have a great time making music. I'll catch you in the next one.